Imagine this for a second. You're walking down a random street in 1985, and suddenly a car passes by that looks like nothing you've ever seen before. It's not massive like the ones from the 70s. It's not covered in chrome, and it's not trying to be classic. It's low, angular, futuristic. It almost feels out of place. And that's exactly the feeling that defined the 1980s, because this was an uncomfortable decade for American design, a transitional era where the old rules no longer worked, but the new ones weren't fully figured out yet. Many manufacturers got lost trying, but some got it exactly right. They created cars with such a strong identity that even today, decades later, they still turn heads like they just rolled off the showroom floor. And that's exactly why. They became unforgettable. In this video, we're going to take a look at the most beautiful American cars of the 1980s. And trust me, some of them don't look the way you'd expect. Let's begin. 1984 Chevrolet Corvette C4. And it all starts with a car that didn't just change design, it completely changed the direction of one of America's most iconic names, the Corvette C4. Because when it arrived in 1984, this wasn't just a new generation, it was a complete break from the past. After years with the C3, more curved, more classic, Chevrolet decided to do something radical. The C4 came in with much cleaner lines, sharper angles, and a low, wide stance that instantly made it feel more modern, more European even, but still unmistakably American. Visually, the change was obvious from every angle. The low front end, the pop-up headlights, the completely redesigned body, and that incredibly clean side profile created a silhouette that looked like it was built to slice through the air. This was no longer a car looking at the past. It was looking straight into the future. And in the 1980s, that's exactly what made it stand out. Inside, the transformation was just as important. The interior introduced a much more technological approach, with a digital dashboard that, at the time, looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. This wasn't just a sports car, it was a different experience, something new. But the Corvette couldn't rely on design alone. It had to back it up with performance. Under the hood, it featured a 5.7-liter L83 V8, producing around 205 horsepower in its early versions. That might not sound impressive today, but back then, combined with an all-new chassis, it made the car feel far more precise and balanced than its predecessor. It could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 7 seconds, a solid figure for an American sports car in the mid-80s. But the most important thing about the C4 wasn't just how it moved, it was how it looked doing it. Because this Corvette achieved something very difficult. It was modern, without losing its identity. Today, the 1984 Corvette C4 has become an increasingly appreciated piece, especially for what it represents in the model's history. A well-maintained example typically sells between $15,000 and $35,000, with exceptional units reaching even higher prices. It wasn't the most powerful Corvette, but it was one of the most important. 1981, DeLorean DMC-12. And now the list takes a completely unexpected turn, because if the Corvette represented the future from an established brand, the next car tried to create that future from scratch. And yes, this car isn't just remembered for its design, it's remembered for everything around it. But before we talk about its story, just look at it. Because even today, decades later, the DeLorean still feels like a car out of place. The unpainted stainless steel body, the straight lines, the low profile, and, of course, the iconic gull-wing doors. It didn't look like anything else on American roads in the early 1980s. It was strange. It was futuristic. And that's exactly why it was impossible to ignore. It was the kind of car that made people stop and stare. But what's interesting is that the DeLorean wasn't born as just a visual experiment. John DeLorean wanted to create something different, a sports car that combined design, innovation, and a completely unique identity within the American market. And in terms of design, he succeeded. The DMC-12 was designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, one of the most important names in automotive design, and you can see it in every line of the car. Everything feels clean, geometric, almost conceptual, But where the DeLorean failed to meet expectations was performance. Under the hood, it had a 2.8-liter PRV V6, producing around 130 horsepower. It wasn't a slow car, but it didn't quite live up to what its appearance promised, and even so, that wasn't enough to stop it. Because the DeLorean was never just a car. It was an idea, an attempt to do something different in an industry that was beginning to change. Today, that unique character has made it one of the most recognizable cars of the entire decade. A well-kept DeLorean DMC-12 typically sells between $50,000 and $90,000, with exceptional examples easily exceeding that range. It wasn't the fastest, nor the most refined, but it was probably one of the most memorable cars of the 1980s. 1987, Buick GNX. And now we arrive at one of the most respected and most unexpected cars of the entire decade. Because if the DeLorean stood out for its design, the GNX did it for something much simpler: respect. This car didn't need to be flashy to stand out. In fact, at first glance, it looked pretty understated. Black paint, clean lines, no visual excess. But that's exactly where its strength was. It looked normal until it started moving. The GNX was the final evolution of the already well-known Grand National, but taken to a completely different level. Buick, together with McLaren Performance Technologies, created a much more radical, more refined, and much faster version. And you could feel that in every detail. Under the hood, it featured a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6, officially rated at 276 horsepower. Although in reality, many agree the true number was significantly higher. But beyond the number, what really mattered was how that power was delivered: explosive, direct, without warning. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 5.5 seconds, a figure that, at the time, put it ahead of many much more expensive sports cars. It was genuinely fast. But what made it even more special was its rarity. Buick produced only 547 units, making it one of the most exclusive muscle cars of the entire decade. And that shows today. A 1987 Buick GNX can easily exceed $120,000, with pristine examples reaching even higher figures. And now, I want to hear your opinion. Out of the three cars we've seen so far, the modern Corvette C4, the futuristic DeLorean DMC-12, and the brutal Buick GNX, which one do you find the most impressive? Let me know in the comments. Because what's coming next takes us to a completely different interpretation of luxury in the 1980s. 1983 Lincoln Continental Mark VI. And now the list completely shifts in energy, because after three cars defined by futuristic design and performance, we return to something much more classic, much more American. This car perfectly represents an idea that was still very much alive in the 1980s, traditional luxury. While many manufacturers were beginning to experiment with new shapes and concepts, Lincoln chose to follow a completely different philosophy: elegance, presence, and a clear sense of status. Visually, it was the complete opposite of the Corvette or the DeLorean. The body was more squared off, more formal, with proportions that clearly echoed the large luxury cars of previous decades. The imposing front end, the chrome grille, the clean lines, and that long profile created a car that wasn't trying to be sporty. It didn't need to be. This was a car built for something else, to communicate success. But that doesn't mean it was outdated. In fact, the Mark VI was one of the first Lincoln models to incorporate more modern elements, including optional digital instrumentation and electronic systems that were beginning to define the decade. It was an interesting mix: classic design with emerging technology. Inside, the focus was clear: absolute comfort, wide seats, soft materials, refined finishes, and a driving experience designed to be quiet and relaxed. This wasn't the kind of car you drove fast. It was the kind of car you enjoyed. Under the hood, it offered engines like the 5.0-liter V8, focused more on smoothness and efficiency than outright performance. At the time, it represented one of the highest levels of luxury within Lincoln, aimed at buyers who wanted something elegant, comfortable, and with a strong presence on the road. Today, a well-preserved 1983 Lincoln Continental Mark 6 typically sells between $12,000 and $30,000, depending on condition and originality. It wasn't revolutionary, but it didn't need to be, because in a decade full of change, this Lincoln chose something different, to keep the essence of classic American luxury alive. 1988 Oldsmobile Toronado Trofeo. And now, we completely shift the tone once again. Because if the Lincoln represented classic luxury, the next car represents the exact opposite. An attempt to push that luxury into the future, the Toronado Trofeo. And from the very first glance, you can tell. The lines are much cleaner, more aerodynamic, with a design that completely abandons traditional shapes. It sits lower, looks wider, and carries a silhouette that already starts leaning toward what the 1990s would become. This was Oldsmobile clearly saying, luxury can be modern too. But the most interesting part of this car wasn't just on the outside, it was inside. The Trofeo was one of the most technological models Oldsmobile had produced up to that point. It introduced a completely new interior approach, with digital elements, electronic controls, and in some versions, even early touchscreen displays. By the late 1980s, that was incredibly advanced, almost experimental. It was the kind of car you didn't just want to drive, you wanted to explore. Mechanically, it also had a key feature that set it apart from many American cars at the time: front-wheel drive, something uncommon for coupes of this size and category. But it gave it a different driving feel, more stable in certain conditions, and more aligned with that modern approach. Under the hood, it featured a 3.8-liter V6, an engine focused more on efficiency and comfort than outright performance. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 9 seconds, maintaining that smooth character that defined the car. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't trying to be. The Toronado Trofeo was something else. It was a vision, an attempt to redefine what an American luxury car could be in a decade where everything was changing. Today, a well-preserved 1988 Oldsmobile Toronado. Trofeo typically sells between $8,000 and $20,000, making it one of the most affordable cars on this list, but also one of the most interesting from a historical perspective. 1987. Pontiac Firebird Trans Am GTA. This car didn't try to be subtle. It didn't try to be elegant. It tried to be striking. And it achieved that from the very first second. Visually, the GTA was pure 1980s language. The low body, sharp lines, aerodynamic details, and that aggressive front end created a presence that looked built for speed even while standing still. This was the kind of car that never went unnoticed. Never. But beyond its appearance, it also had something to back it up. Real performance. Under the hood, it carried a 5.7-liter V8, producing around 210 to 225 horsepower, depending on the configuration. It wasn't the most extreme muscle car ever built, but it was one of the most balanced of its time, powerful, but also manageable. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 6.5 seconds. A very respectable figure for the late 1980s. And that's what made it so interesting, because the GTA wasn't just a flashy car. It was a car that delivered. It also had something that many cars on this list share: cultural presence. This generation of Firebird became a symbol of its era, appearing in movies, TV shows, and becoming part of the visual identity of an entire generation. Today, a well-kept 1987 Pontiac Trans Am GTA typically sells between $20,000 and $45,000, with exceptional examples reaching even higher values. And now, I want to hear your opinion. Out of the last 3 cars we've seen, the elegant Lincoln Mark 6, the futuristic Toronado Trofeo, and the aggressive Trans Am GTA, which one do you find the most interesting? Let me know in the comments. 1989 Chrysler TC by Maserati. And now the list takes another unexpected turn, because if the Trans Am represented American attitude in its purest form, the next car is something completely different, a collaboration. The name alone already says a lot, because this wasn't just any Chrysler, it was the result of a partnership between an American brand and one of the most recognized names in Italian design. And you can see it. Visually, it takes a much more refined, elegant approach, with smooth lines and proportions that feel closer to a European car than a typical American model from the 1980s. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't over the top, it was restrained. But that restraint is exactly what made it stand out in the US market. The clean front end, the attention to detail, and the compact profile created a car that felt designed for a very specific kind of buyer, someone looking for something different, something more exclusive. Inside, that same feeling continued. High-quality materials, more detailed finishes than what was typical for Chrysler, and a clear intention to deliver a more European-style luxury experience. This was a car trying to position itself on another level, but like many ambitious projects, the reality was more complicated. Under the hood, it offered different options, including a turbocharged inline-4 and a 3.0-liter V6, depending on the version. None of them were particularly impressive in terms of performance. Adequate, but not exciting. And that pretty much defined the car, because the TC wasn't a total failure, but it also didn't fully live up to the expectations its name created. Still, over time, it has become one of the most curious and uncommon cars of the decade. A well-kept 1989 Chrysler TC by Maserati typically sells between $10,000 and $25,000, remaining relatively affordable, but increasingly appreciated for its unique story. It wasn't the most powerful, nor the most iconic, but it was one of the cars that best represented a very specific idea of the 1980s, trying something different, even if it didn't always work out perfectly. 1985 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz. And now we return to one of the strongest and most recognizable names in American luxury. Because if there's one thing Cadillac understood perfectly, even in the middle of all the changes of the 1980s, it was how to make a car feel special, and the Biarritz was exactly that. Visually, this car represents a much more refined version of the decade's design language. It's not aggressive like the Trans Am, nor futuristic like the Corvette. It's elegant, but in a very specific way. The body is more compact than in previous decades, yet it maintains very balanced proportions with clean lines, subtle chrome details, and a presence that communicates luxury without needing to exaggerate. And there's one detail that defines it perfectly: the vinyl roof, the carefully finished trim, and that clear focus on comfort. This was a car designed to look good, without making noise, but where it truly stood out was inside. Cadillac knew that luxury wasn't just about the exterior. The Biarritz cabin offered extremely comfortable seats, soft materials, refined details, and a driving experience entirely focused on calmness. This was a car to enjoy. No rush, no effort. Under the hood, it featured engines like the 4.1-liter V8, focused more on smoothness and efficiency than outright performance. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. The Biarritz was something else. It was a statement of style. At the time, it represented one of the highest levels of equipment within Cadillac, aimed at buyers who wanted comfort, elegance, and a clear sense of status. Today, a well-preserved 1985 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz typically sells between $15,000 and $35,000, with especially well-maintained examples exceeding that range. 1986 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. And now the list returns to much more familiar ground, but with a different approach. Because unlike the Corvette or the Trans Am, this car wasn't trying to be the most extreme. It was trying to be something smarter, a more refined muscle car, more balanced. Visually, it had a very particular presence. It wasn't as aggressive as other sports cars of the era, but it wasn't just a simple coupe either. The body kept clean lines with a long, slightly sloped silhouette that gave it a more refined look. At the same time, details like the SS graphics, the specific wheels, and its overall stance made it clear this wasn't just any car. It was subtle, but intentional. And that's exactly what made it interesting. Because the Monte Carlo didn't shout, it suggested. Under the hood, it carried a 5.0-liter V8 with around 180 horsepower. Not an impressive number on paper, but combined with its setup and weight, it delivered a well-balanced driving experience. It could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 7.5 seconds, quick enough to feel responsive without losing that more refined character. And that was its strength. It wasn't the fastest, but it didn't need to be. It was a car that blended two worlds, a bit of luxury, a bit of performance, and an aesthetic that fit perfectly with the decade. It also had something very important: cultural presence. This model was highly popular in its time, especially in the United States, appearing in television, racing series like NASCAR, and becoming part of the collective identity of the 1980s. Today, a well-kept 1986 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS typically sells between $20,000 and $50,000, with especially original examples reaching even higher values. It wasn't the flashiest, but it was probably one of the most honest cars on this list, and sometimes that's exactly what makes it special. 1989 Cadillac Allante. And now we arrive at the car that closes this list, and probably one of the most ambitious of the entire decade, the Allante. Because this wasn't just another luxury model. It was Cadillac making a direct attempt to compete with the best in the world, but not from the United States, from Europe. And that alone made it different from the very beginning. The Allante was designed and partially built in Italy by Pininfarina, one of the most important names in automotive design. The bodies were manufactured there, and then transported to the United States for final assembly. That process alone made it something unique, and also extremely expensive. Visually, it took a completely different approach compared to the rest of Cadillac's lineup in the 1980s. It was lower, more compact, with clean lines and proportions that brought it much closer to a European roadster than to a traditional American car. It didn't look like a typical Cadillac, and that was the point. The clean front end, the balanced silhouette, and the lack of excess made it one of the most refined designs the brand produced during the decade. It was elegant, but modern. Inside, the car maintained that luxury focus, but with a more technological presentation, incorporating digital elements and a more contemporary feel compared to other Cadillac models. It was clearly a step toward the future. Under the hood, it featured a 4.5-liter V8, producing around 200 horsepower. It wasn't a pure sports car, but it delivered a smooth, stable driving experience, exactly what you'd expect from a luxury convertible. But beyond the numbers, what truly defined the Allante was its concept. It was a car that tried to change the perception of Cadillac, make it more global, more modern, more competitive. And although it wasn't a massive commercial success, over time, it has become one of the most interesting and distinctive models the brand ever produced. Today, a well-preserved 1989 Cadillac Allante typically sells between $20,000 and $45,000, becoming increasingly appreciated for its unique story. And now, after seeing all these cars, one thing becomes very clear. The 1980s were not an easy decade. They were a time of change, experimentation, and often risky decisions. Some designs didn't age well, others were forgotten, but some achieved something much harder. They created a true identity, and in a decade like the 1980s, that was everything. Now I want to hear your opinion. Out of all the cars we saw today, the futuristic Corvette C4, the iconic DeLorean, the brutal Buick GNX, or even the refined Cadillac Allante, which one do you think is the most beautiful of all? Let me know in the comments, because it's always interesting to see which type of design connects most with each person. And if you enjoyed this journey, I recommend the video currently on your screen, where we explore the most beautiful American cars of the 1970s. A completely different decade, with a much more fluid, more elegant style, and a design philosophy that contrasts entirely with what we've just seen. Click Continue the journey through the evolution of American design, and I'll see you in the next video.